Okay, we might get started then. All right, thanks everyone for joining us for the latest Paddles Up session. We're fortunate tonight to be joined by Andrew Hamilton of Red Tape Busters, and he'll be taking us through the world of grants. He will take us through a presentation on the topic, and then we'll highlight some of the current and upcoming grant opportunities for our clubs, and then we might finish up with a Q&A if that's okay with Andrew. All right, well, I'll chuck it over straight to Andrew. Thank you.
Thanks, Ramsey. I'll just get you to hit the down button at the appropriate times. Thank you, everybody, for having me this afternoon, and thank you for giving us of your precious time. So, as Ramsey mentioned, we're going to have a conversation around grant writing, the bit of the how-to, the process I go through. And what I'd say to you up front is I'm very much like you. I'm there writing grants for clients in the same sort of way as you're probably wanting to write grants, etc., for your own clubs and things to secure that precious funding that we all need. So think of me as very much walking in your shoes. Ramsey, you just mind flicking to, or maybe that'll work. No, can you just flick to the next slide, please? All right, so what we'll cover. So Ramsey, if you just flick down as we go, please. A bit of education, how to actually write a grant. Where do I go? Who can I talk to? Some tools to improve your chance of success, a grant matrix template, and also a set of grant writing guiding principles. Yep, please keep going. So a little bit about how to. Ramsey, next slide, please. So what I'm going to say to you up front is think of this as applying for a job or undertaking renovation on your house. You don't want to do a rubbish job. You don't want to rush it. There's a lot riding on it. So you need to give it some time. And like anything, if what you invest is hopefully what you're going to get out of it. So think of it very much along those lines. Next slide, please. So some suggestions. Start with developing what I call a spreadsheet of grant opportunities. So what needs to actually go into that? Yep, okay. So the actual grant organisation name, the actual grant name itself. Now, the difference between those two will be that the grant organisation name might be a particular government department. It might be the Office of Responsible, or the easiest one is probably the Office of Sport. Then the grant name might be Her Sport, Her Way. That's what I mean by that. Have a look at what the particular focus areas are within the grant itself, within what we call the funding guidelines, and I'll come on to those in a little bit, and focus in particular on what the criteria is and what the objectives are. Yep, next one, please. Look at whether you're eligible. Now, I will say that if you're looking at as an example, a grant application with the Office of Sport, you're always going to be, it's always going to be relevant to you. But there's a hell of a lot of breadth in this particular space. And I will use acronyms, and I'm sorry that I'm doing that, but that's oftentimes what we actually see in the eligibility criteria. So your LGAs are your local government areas, that's your council. NFP is obviously not-for-profit. Your organisations are all not-for-profits. NGOs is not something that we have to worry too much about, but that's non-government organisations. So I'm just going to move screen over a fraction. That's better. There might be different community organisations. So there might be recreational bodies out there that are allowed to apply. There can be charities, and there can be other incorporated bodies as well. So in terms of most of the applications you're probably looking at, chances are you'd be looking for community organisations, or in particular an incorporated sporting organisation. Yep, Ramsey, please. Most important, look at the opening and closing dates. We don't get a lot of time generally. Oftentimes these grants open, you might have 3 to 4 weeks, so there's just not necessarily a lot of time. So it's very important to be mindful of those sorts of things. Yep, keep going. What are the minimum and the maximum amounts you can apply for? That's really crucial. Sometimes we want a hell of a lot, but it's not the maximum amount we can get. Sometimes we don't want too much, but there still can be a minimum amount. So just be mindful of those sorts of basic things. Please, yep, keep going. Some other helpful information to include. Are there multiple rounds? And I'll give an example. Some of you may be familiar with the Office of Responsible Gambling's infrastructure grant. which has grants of $50,000 to $200,000 for sporting organisations. In this current financial year, there are 3 rounds. That's a little bit unusual, but I'll explain a little bit more about why we're seeing some of those sorts of things. So sometimes there can be multiple rounds. So you might see something that is coming up, e.g. in November, and then you might think, oh, I really want to get into that, but you think, oh, I don't know if I'll actually get all the information together. So some reassurance, there is a round in March next year. So I'd say sometimes don't panic about these things. Yep, Ramsey, keep going, please. When will results be announced? You might want to start your project in 3 months' time, but the announcement won't be known for 4 months' time. That's not uncommon. So just some simple basic things like that to be aware of. Yep, keep going, please. What's the total pool of funds? Sometimes it's mentioned, sometimes it's not. And what do I mean by that? Well, there is a maximum amount of money in any grant round. Hypothetically, it might be $10 million. If something's only $1 or $2 million or a few $100,000, I probably wouldn't even touch it because the chances of success are really, really low. Where there's a larger pool of funds for a particular round, now the maximum amount of grant might be large as well, but chances are you've got a better chance if there is a larger pool of funds. Completion dates. So that's basically when you need to have your project completed by. Generally, there's a lot of time. You might have 12 to 18 months, but sometimes there can be delays for various reasons in you getting your application up and going, and then obviously if you're successful in just getting your actual project underway. So just some things to be mindful of, so that you just obviously don't run into pressure towards the end. Sometimes you'll be able to get an idea of what the average amount awarded is. So again, if you want $50,000 and that's the maximum amount, but what we see is that the average amount is maybe 15 or 20, then the chances of getting the maximum amount are pretty hard. So they're just learnings and just information to be aware of. Sometimes it's worth having a look at who's been a recipient in the past. That gives you some indication of what your chances are, whether there's a similar type of organisation to yourself, how much they received and what was their project for. And then that gives you a bit of an idea as to whether you may have a chance with your application as well. Yep, keep going, please, Ramsey. So just to get an idea, so where can you go? Because this is one of the issues that I encounter on a weekly basis. Sport New South Wales has a really, really good updated, if you like, list of current current grants, and they also publish them on whenever they're sending anything that's new, whenever they're sending them out through their newsletter. It costs you nothing, obviously, to go to their website, and you can look up grants on their website. You can also subscribe. Again, I'm constantly advertising grant opportunities because I generally feed them with a lot of them as I see them. So that's certainly worthwhile. Something that's really important to do also is populate your spreadsheet. So as you see grants come up, keep filling in your spreadsheet, and it gives you an idea as to when grants are likely to come up. Keep going, please, Ramsey. So determine what it is you might want to apply for. So you need to have some ideas. How do you go about that? Talk to your colleagues, talk to your committee that you're wanting to play in. So in other words, talk within your own community. Keep going, please, Ramsey. We always have a large list, and the list never gets any shorter. But what I'll always say is prioritise it. And that can be hard, but it actually is really important. When you create your wish list and you've got a series of grants that you might be interested in, what I suggest is to match the actual wish list against the grants opportunities. So that way you can actually focus on what we call the grant objectives and the finer details and the funding guidelines. In other words, if you want to do an infrastructure project, but you're looking at a participation grant, well, pretty obviously they don't match. If you want some equipment, for example, and it might be the Office of Sports local sporting grants program, I think it is from memory, then that's something that would be relevant. So it's really important to look at matching your priority list and your wish list against the grant opportunities that are available. Next, please, Ramsey. So I mentioned subscribe to some grant company email distribution lists. This is also helpful and they come out all the time. Sometimes you can go to individual companies. As I've mentioned, get on the Office of Sport. I've mentioned Sport New South Wales, but also get onto the Office of Sports email distribution list. Again, it doesn't cost anything. And whenever the Office of Sport has their grants opening or that are going to be opening soon, they will include them within their e-news. Another one that's actually really helpful if you're wanting to pick up any state government or even federal government for that matter, get onto your local members email distribution list. Again, it costs you nothing to subscribe to those things, and state members they're always wanting to plug anything that they're doing or that the state government is doing. So again, just get onto your local members email distribution list. It can be state, it can be federal, it doesn't matter, because there are relevant grants at all levels, and that actually can be quite helpful. I'd probably say as well, I suspect Ramsey will probably circulate this presentation as well at some point. So don't be too concerned about trying to write a million things down. If you want to go down another path, you can easily pick up subscriptions through something like the Funding Centre. It's actually not expensive on an annual basis just to have a basic a basic subscription. And there's something like about 3,000 grants, and you can just get emails on a weekly basis, which just gives you a rundown of the different grants that are open at that particular time. Something that's important is also just to be monitoring opening and closing dates. And I mentioned before that it can be difficult to know when a grant's going to open, and I've found this in particular in this current in this environment, and that's been like that way for probably 18 months now, I guess. But to get some sort of an idea, and if you look at history, then you'll get an idea as to when it's likely to open in the future as well. So that just helps you in terms of your preparation and your planning. Thanks, Ramsey. Once you find one that's open, so what are your steps that you'll go through? I can't stress this enough. Read the funding guidelines carefully. They're your Bible. Always keep going back to them. I'm constantly referring to them. It's the first thing I'll go and look at when I know a grant's about to open or when it has opened, is I go and read the guidelines and see how things have changed or what's the focus that I need to be looking at. And I'll say quite openly, don't apply just for the sake of it. There is a lot of time involved in putting an application together, particularly a quality application. If you don't think it's time for you to do it, then I would say wait for another round or look for something else. Thanks, Ramsey. Determine who you'll need to get information from. There could be a range of people within your own communities, in your own cases, president, treasurer. There might be different. There might be a manager of sorts. If it's say a state sporting organisation, there might be operations staff. There might be a committee chair. Some of you may have different committees, if you like. If you're wanting, and I mentioned what's called Profile ID. That's a free service that picks up and summarises all the information from the census. Now, appreciate that the last census we had where information is available was the 2016 census, but this actually picks up information across lots and lots of areas from your local government authority, and that's really, really helpful. I refer to reports from council areas using this particular format. This particular function in lots of applications. It's tremendously powerful. Letters of support become really important. You might want to approach, in your case, your state sporting organisation, in this case, Dragon Boats New South Wales. You might want to ask your local member or perhaps even your federal member for a letter of support. If you give them enough time, they'll be more than happy to support it. Keep going, please, Ramsey. I'll say just create a bit of a project plan. Now, this can be really basic. It's a bit of a timeline about when you're going to need information by. With more complex applications, I'll actually write one and I'll share it with my client to give them an understanding as to what they need to be doing, what I need to be doing, and when we need information by. But it just can be quite helpful just to note down when you need information by in order to drop information into your application. but also just to make sure, obviously, you're going to meet the deadline. So I find that quite helpful. I'll say it up front, start writing early. Don't leave it to the last minute. You can generally, what I call drip feed information in. You can drop it in at different stages as you receive information. So just don't leave things to the last minute. And I just keep coming back to it. I'll stress it. Keep referring back to the funding guidelines. If it's helpful, print them out, highlight them. I do a lot of that. I mean, I'll go to that degree sometimes with applications as well, just so I've got them handy and I can just keep referring back to them all the time. Thanks, Ramsey. A really important but a really basic thing. Ask yourself, have I answered the question with the content that you're putting in? It's amazing how many times I've seen information written in an application. And look, I do it myself from time to time. I'll drop information in and I think, actually, no, that doesn't fit there, and I'll actually move it. So it is really important that to certainly answer the question. Make sure your writing is clear and concise. Go with a bit of an approach or a bit of a philosophy of less is more. We don't need huge amounts of content. We just need to be really clear and concise about the information we actually put in. I will say that at times language and keywords can become are really, really important, and they're tremendously powerful. I will say that a lot of time we just think of our sport as our sport, and we expect that whomever's reading our application knows everything about our sport. It's actually need to go the other way. We actually have to almost transcend ourselves a little bit and stop thinking about our sport and assume that the person who's going to read your application knows absolutely nothing. So there are some key words that I look to use from quite regularly when I'm writing applications. Words such as embed, enable. In other words, what I mean by that is your sport might enable a particular group of people to be able to participate. So sport is generally known as what we call an enabler. Sustainable. Sometimes, particularly if we're writing government applications for government, there are some buzzwords that the government love to hear. And they love to hear words like sustainable, evidence-based, research, dare I say it, innovation, collaboration. So there's a bit of a list there. So it's just really important to keep some of these things in mind when we're actually writing the application. And as I say, just think of your sport, and I use this from time to time in applications. The sport is a tool to achieve an outcome. It can be a vehicle to choosing an outcome. It's not just about the sport itself. Thanks, Ramsey. Write the application over several sittings. The number of times that I'll be writing an application and the words just aren't flowing. And I just might need to step away from it and go and do something else for a while and come back to it. Just stating the obvious, don't necessarily try and do it all in one go. It can be quite helpful just to, I'll call it the Swiss cheese effect. Just cut a piece and eat it one piece at a time and come back to it later. And again, I mentioned it, assume that the assessor knows nothing about your sport or your club. So that's why I describe it as a little bit of transcending yourself. Photos and imagery is really powerful. If there's an opportunity where you can actually embed photos into your application, take every opportunity you can. The number of times that I'll be reading information and I can't quite get my head around it, and I'll actually say to a client, listen, can you send me some photos on this? And all of a sudden a light bulb goes on, and I actually find that really helpful. Review your application. One of the downsides is that we often are writing applications in some sort of a system, in some sort of portal. It's not as if we're necessarily writing them in a Word document. There's nothing wrong with doing that. Some people will write them in a Word document, and they can use the Microsoft Word functionality to help check the number of words there are, check spelling and grammar, all those sorts of bits and pieces. That's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with doing that. But I will always say, review your application, get someone else to review it as well, because somebody else will pick up some things that you've missed. And I will do that from time to time, because again, there's just things that I miss from time to time as well. Stating the obvious, check your spelling and grammar. I'm really particular about those sorts of things. I actually get distracted when I'm reading an application or if I'm assessing something and I pick up spelling and grammar. It actually distracts my thinking away from the context of what I'm reading and understanding what it is I'm reading. So it becomes really important. In terms of your ask, be realistic. Don't go for a ridiculous amount. You won't get it. The amount needs to be realistic according to what it is you're actually wanting to achieve. Don't leave things to the last minute to submit. I'll always say to a client, look, I'd prefer to submit it 24, even 48 hours beforehand. It does happen from time to time where things get submitted on the day. I don't like that. Closing times and closing dates can vary. They can be midday, they can be 2 o'clock in the afternoon, so they can be 5 o'clock, sometimes they're midnight. Now, one of the problems if it's midnight is if for some reason there's some technical glitch, there's nobody you can get hold of to talk to. So you might have done all this great work and written this great application, and unfortunately there's some sort of technical glitch that's preventing you from getting the application in. So just some little, again, just a little cheat sheet just to keep that in mind. Thanks, Ramsey. I will also say, don't be offended if your application is unsuccessful. I'll elaborate on that a little bit more in a moment. Make sure you ask for some feedback. I'll always say, where to go looking. Go for what I call the low-hanging fruit. Go to the Office of Sport, have a look whether your local government authority is offering that may be relevant, and look at sport-specific grants. There are grants around, there's been a couple just recently, that do talk about sport angles, but when you actually have a look at the recipients over the last few years, there's hardly been any sports in there. So sometimes I think the government departments might want to include sport and recreation, but it actually can be pretty difficult at times to actually have any chance of success just because of those you're actually competing against. I'll just come back to the don't be offended if your application is unsuccessful. To give you some insight, all the grant rounds will be oversubscribed, more so in this last probably 12 to 18 months. To give you an example, probably 18 months ago, I was operating on a 50% success rate. I reckon I'm probably operating on a 30% success rate now. It's not because the quality of my application is less, but the competition out there for money is just more. Everybody's after it. But also when I say don't be offended if it's unsuccessful, think of it as an investment. You might have done a lot of work now. It may not have been successful in this round, but it might be next time. So just think of it as an investment all the time. What I'll also say is so that the process for you writing an application for hypothetically $5,000 is the same as it is if you're writing and you're applying for 50K. So this is very much a process-related activity that we're undertaking. Thanks, Ramsey. So I've mentioned there, look, these days, less than 10% of applications received are funded. It's just the reality of the environment that we're in these days, and it's hard to see how that's going to change. But what I will also say, and I'll just elaborate in a moment on this, there's going to be more and more money out there given the situation that we're finding ourselves in. I will also say to you, don't be afraid. Have the courage to reach out for help in this space. People can engage the right consultant. It doesn't cost a lot if you get the right person. And I'm not trying to do this as a sales pitch. I just want more money to come into sport. I work in sport full time. I do this consulting work and grant writing on the side, and I have a very heavy focus towards sport. I'm more than happy to answer questions, respond to emails and those sorts of things, and help in any way that I can if it's just giving some advice from time to time. So just sort of give a little bit of an overview of what's happened in this last probably 2 years. Now, stating the obvious, most of you will be able to work this one out, but it gives you some understanding, and it also gives you some understanding of what's happening in the environment, but also just what the trend's been in terms of where money's going. Next one, thanks, Ramsey. Obviously, a couple of years ago, we had drought. So there was a lot of money towards drought. In New South Wales in particular, that's all pretty much, excuse the pun, but that's dried up. If you're in Queensland, there's still plenty of money around for drought. If you're in South Australia, same sort of thing. There's plenty of money in regional areas in South Australia because a lot of the states actually in drought. Even in Tasmania, the east coast of Tasmania is in drought. The northwest coast is just about flooded. So we go from one extreme to the other, and there's money around for those. Yep, thanks, Ramsey. Obviously, we've had the bushfires. Now, there is still some bushfire money around for recovery in that particular space. It has dropped off significantly. And stating the obvious, COVID. So what's been happening in this last little while, what have been the areas of focus? Obviously, there's been a focus on the recovery from natural disasters, but also as well around money towards future proofing against natural disasters. With the impact of COVID, there's been what I call the emergence around money towards well-being and mental fitness or mental health. Keep going, thanks, Ramsey. What I will say is there's been a hell of a lot of money that's obviously been tossed in around COVID, and it's particularly targeting infrastructure. One simple reason why, it's about jobs. The government needs to keep the economy going, and the obvious way to do that is by investing in infrastructure because it actually creates jobs. I'll give you a very specific example. Even just last week, the state government here made an announcement they're going to spend $5 billion in Western Sydney alone. They didn't mention over what period of time, but 3 million of that will go towards community-based activities, community-based infrastructure, parks, community organisations, sporting organisations, etc. as well. So the governments are going to continue to invest in that particular space for exactly that reason. So just thought I'd give you a little bit of an overview of just some grants that are around and a little bit of indication of perhaps what sort of hours are involved. And I'll also say don't be turned off by some of these. So I will say some of these I'm a supporter of and some of them I'm not for different reasons. The Greater City Sport Facility Fund and the Regional Sport Facility Fund have currently got round 2 happening. And they close, I think it's on the 8th of October. So these are through the Office of Sport. I think it's about $50 million for each from memory, or it might have been $50 million over 2 years for each. So I think it's 100 million maybe in total. It sounds great. And I've had a number of clients contact me and say, hey, look, we'd really like to submit an application. And I've walked them through it and actually talked them out of it. There's a hell of a lot of work put into some of these, and I actually think the chances of success are pretty low. Now, somebody obviously has to be successful. I don't have an issue with that, but to me, there's some key criteria that I'm focusing on if I was going to be writing an application for one of these. The local sport grant program, so that's through the Office of Sport. That should be opening pretty soon. It's normally about this time of year, maybe the next few weeks. So no doubt that'll be hopefully that will be coming up. I mentioned before, so infrastructure, there's Clubs New South Wales, what we call Category 3. It's an infrastructure grant. Sport and recreation is entitled to grants of between $50,000 and $200,000. That'll open early November, and there'll be another round in March 2022. And I've also just put some hours alongside these. If I was writing an application for some of these, probably for the Clubs New South Wales, I'm probably somewhere between 12 and 15 hours, give or take a little bit. If it's the first application I'm writing for a client, it's going to take more. If I've written for a client before, then there are some economies of scale. So again, if you're writing for a grant, if you're writing an application for a particular type of grant, you actually can take information from others that you've written, you can copy it across and just massage the information. So that's quite helpful. The community building partnerships is an electorate-based application, electorate-based grant, state government grant application. That will open about March 2022. It's normally about $300,000 per electorate. But again, the government this financial year has kicked the tin for another 30%, so that'll be $400,000. And there's various types of areas that you can focus on in that one. And then I just mentioned before, obviously, that there'll be this new West Invest Fund. So I'll say watch this space for information that comes out about that one in a little bit of time. So there are constantly grants around for you to explore. That's just some. They are evolving. It's been very, I suppose the market's been very checkered in the last 12 to 18 months. times where we thought grants were going to open, they haven't. It's been sporadic as well, but just because of the uncertainty of the environment. But certainly there are lots of grant opportunities that are around. And I've just mentioned here some tools just obviously to improve your chances. You can actually go on to the Sport New South Wales website under resources. You'll actually find a grant matrix template there. It's just an Excel spreadsheet, but it's something that I've put together. It's something that I use for my clients, and it's there if you want to download that and use that for your own purposes. I've also worked with Sport New South Wales to update their grant writing guiding principles. So there's actually quite a detailed list, apart from obviously this presentation, but there's a detailed list that you can refer to at any time, which will actually give you, again, as I say, a set of grant writing guiding principles. Local councils will often have some guidelines. Some of them are more active than others, but that's another space. And it's pretty easy, even just by doing some searching just online, if you're just wanting some tips to find some basic stuff. I think that might just about cover it. So I hope that wasn't too quick. I know it's a lot of information to digest, but I hope what you'll see from that is it's very much a process to work through. It's not something to be daunted by. My view is it's actually something to be embraced. But like I said, it's like a job application or a house renovation. I'll say treat it with respect, because there does need to be quite a lot of work invested into writing these, obviously to give yourself the best chances of success.
That's great. Did anyone have any questions for Andrew? Feel free to take yourself off mute.
This is Christine Dunon from Hawkesbury River Dragons. Andrew, I have a question, and I don't know whether you can answer this. When the grant money is received,
yep.
How are the clubs accountable for that?
Yeah, good question. Depends on the amount. So sometimes some grant funders will require there to be an accountability piece. If it's a large amount of money, there might need to be some sort of an acquittal. Now, sometimes it can be as simple as a one-pager. It might be a one-page template that the funder has. It might require, e.g., your treasurer to sign off and say, yep, we've spent the money according to the guidelines. If it's a large amount of money, sometimes it actually might even need an auditor. So a lot of organisations, particularly incorporated, need to have their books audited on an annual basis. Sometimes there actually might need to be a proper formal acquittal process of the funding as well, and an auditor has to sign off on it. And you might actually need to have that paperwork completed and actually submit it. There might even be a residual amount of funds at the end, hypothetically maybe 10%. I've seen that happen before as well, where you don't get the balance of your funds until you've actually submitted your acquittal paperwork. Let me also say that governments will probably go down those sorts of paths, but they won't always do it, particularly for smaller amounts of money. They do want the money spent, and they need it obviously spent appropriately. So there is, I'll say, a little bit of a trust and an honour process as part of it as well. But every grant equally will be different. Sometimes there are contracts that need to be signed up to, but the number of times that I actually see applications that are successful and there actually aren't detailed contracts that need to be signed up to, it kind of astounds me a little bit. So I sort of call this whole grant writing space, it's a bit of a dog at breakfast, because every grant is different, but that gives you at least a little bit of an overview of, let me say, that accountability piece and whether it does or it doesn't exist. Does that help, Christine?
It does, but the reason I ask is that we have a number of sporting groups that use our local oval, and I think in 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago now, they applied for federal funding and they got over $2 million
wow, okay.
to build a clubhouse and to upgrade an oval. So that's what I was wondering, how do they then have a project, somebody who manages a project that comes out of those funds, especially when there is that amount of money, because you'd have to think there would be some sort of accountability.
Sometimes grant funding will be a staged payment as well. There might be a certain amount that's done, for an amount of that sort of money. There's probably an amount that's paid upfront upon signing of the agreement. There would be project milestones that need to be met for something like that, and you probably find grant funding would be released upon submission and acceptance of project reports, and then another amount of money is allocated, etc. So that's generally what happens with those larger. Pardon me, with those large sums. It's not as if a government would say, "Here's your $2 million."
Yes, that's right. Thanks, Andrew. That's good.
No, that's okay. No problems, Christine.
Anyone else have any questions?
Ramsey, will we have access to this recording?
Yeah, so I'll put it up
slides,
on the I'll put the slides up on our website, and I'll share the video on the Dragon Boats New South Wales YouTube, and I'll put that on social media later this week.
All right, thanks for that.
Ramsey, what I'll also say, if it helps, oftentimes questions can arise later on. There's a lot of information for people to take in. My email address is obviously in the presentation as well. Just to anybody who's on the call, don't hesitate to drop me an email or give me a call if something pops up and you just want to ask a question, etc. And you thought, I should have asked that at the time, but I don't. So just please reach out. I'm certainly happy to respond, and I'll make sure that I do respond promptly as well.
Great. Okay. Well, if there's no other questions, we might finish up. So thank you, Andrew, and thanks everyone for coming. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.